Okay, so welcome everyone to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture, Preservation. You're saving what now? So here are weekly topics and course objectives for this week. What is the difference between preservation and conservation? What steps can archivists take to improve the preservation of their materials? And how have archivists responded to changing notions of preservation? So these are related to four of our course learning objectives. You could probably shoehorn the one related to ethical and social obligations as well. We'll touch on it a little bit, but I feel like these four are probably the most solid connections. And we'll dive into each one of them to varying degrees throughout this lecture. Okay, we'll start by thinking about what exactly is the goal of preservation. So why do archives preserve records? And you could argue that it's a pretty fundamental aspect of archiving, right? If you asked 10 people, nine of them would probably mention preservation as something that archives carry out, something that archives engage in. It might be, yeah, honestly, one of the best things that archives are known for. You know, people may not know that archivists appraise records and arrange and describe records and provide access to records. But there's definitely a strong understanding of archives as institutions that preserve records. And of course, these records are preserved for future use and future access, right? So that, and to the infinite future, as the O'Toole article notes, people will be able to come and use records and interact with records to meet an information need that they have. I would argue that we can go even a little bit further and to say that the goal of preservation is to preserve records in a way that prevents unwanted changes to the record. So having some control over ways in which record changes over time to make sure that the record isn't changing in ways that damages the record or challenges the authenticity of the record. And we'll touch on that in just a second. I would argue that preservation is related to preserving not just the content of a record, but the context of a record as well. And that's something that we'll talk more about when we discuss digital preservation next week, but it is related to analog preservation as well. And so during this lecture, we'll talk about some of the ways that archives go about doing just that, preserving records for the future in a way that minimizes unwanted changes to the record and preserves both the content and the context of the record. And we'll talk about ways that that process has changed over time, the philosophy surrounding that process has changed over time, and just some of the general preservation tools and guidelines that are out there to help archivists structure their preservation efforts. Before we do that, we'll talk a little bit more about preservation as a whole. So this is a definition from the Society of American Archivists Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology. So describing preservation as a professional discipline of protecting materials by minimizing chemical and physical deterioration and damage to minimize the loss of information and extend the life of cultural property. So a lot of the stuff I just talked about. The act of keeping from harm, injury, decay, or destruction, especially through non-invasive treatments. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by non-invasive here in just a little bit. But this definitely implies a level of passivity, right? You're not necessarily intervening strongly to preserve the records, but rather you're taking care of them in a more passive, non-invasive way. Okay, and so the Miller chapter for this week touches on that, describing preservation as the passive protection of archival material. So no physical or chemical treatment is done. And so the passive nature of preservation differs from conservation, which the essay glossary also describes. So here we have the repair or stabilization of materials through chemical or physical treatment to ensure that they survive in their original form as long as possible. And then the profession that engages in conservation efforts. Okay, so the active protection of archival material, the physical act of preservation. So active versus passive. Definitely a big differentiation between preservation and conservation. And again, this emphasis on preserving the records in their original format. And we'll talk about the difference between preserving the information contained in a record and preserving the record in its original format as we move through this lecture. Okay, and then we also have the act of restoration. So the process of rehabilitating an item to return it as nearly as possible to its original condition, undertaken when look of an item is important and there is no danger of altering the authenticity of the original, not common in archives. So I've touched on this example of attempted restoration a couple of times throughout this lecture, but this is obviously an example of restoration gone wrong. So this fresco had obviously become deteriorated, and so some well-intentioned person tried to restore it, and obviously didn't do that good of a job. And this definitely altered the authenticity of the original, right? So it's no longer the creation of whoever painted this in the first place, but it's more so the creation of this individual who tried to restore this fresco in Spain. So again, the idea here is that you have a record that has been decayed for whatever reason. Maybe it's not been preserved very well in the past, but archivists or more typically people in museums or other cultural bodies decide that the record is valuable enough that effort should be undertaken to restore a record to its former glory. And obviously, this is a very active interventionist policy, right? So if you're familiar with the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, I know that that was being restored for a long time and just removing some of the dirt and other things that accumulated and to really bring out the colors and other features that had been sort of muted over the years um, due to deterioration. So that would probably be the most sort of well-documented form of restoration that I can think of. And honestly, this one has become pretty well known as well. Okay, so I've touched a little bit already on the connection between preservation and authenticity. So again, the goal of preservation is to preserve records in a condition as close to the original as possible. And records that are preserved in this way are more authentic. So the closer a record is in look and feel and action as it was to when it was created, the more authentic a record is. So that implies that there haven't been changes over time, tears, and other forms of deterioration that can alter the look and feel of a record. So if you think of a photograph, you take a photograph and it has particular properties, it has colors that look a particular way, the images aren't warped or distorted in any way. If that record is taken care of very well, then, 100 years into the future, that photograph may resemble pretty darn close to its original form. But if for whatever reason the photograph wasn't taken care of, maybe some of the colors have been muted to light exposure, maybe some chemical reactions have caused the image to warp, and that really reduces the authenticity of the record and the overall value of the record as a research object, because what a researcher is looking at is a record that may differ, quite significantly from what the record looked like when it was originally created. So the goal of preservation is, as much as possible, to prevent those types of changes from happening and for the authenticity of records to be maintained. So generally speaking, the more archives intervene in the condition of a record, the more they engage in things like conservation and restoration, the fewer challenges there are going to be to the authenticity of the record. If you have a record that is damaged for whatever reason and you're able to repair it in a way that doesn't impact the record significantly, that doesn't further undermine the authenticity of a record, maybe you're using the same materials that were used when the record was originally created, the same materials in a book binding, or the same type of paint that was used in a painting that you're trying to restore originally. That is going to reverse any of the challenges to authenticity related to a record that might have occurred over time due to poor preservation. Again, assuming that these acts of restoration and conservation are carried out in a sort of skilled and competent manner, right? And you could extend this archival intervention to some of the other things that we'll talk about, such as things like record surveys, climate control, and other steps that archives can take to reduce the potential damage to records and potential questions about the authenticity of a record that may come up if a record has been poorly preserved and damaged over time. So in a lot of ways, you can think of preservation as a pyramid. So most records are going to experience very basic levels of preservation. So similar to collection level description, very broad collection level preservation. And there might be items that are subjected to this more active preservation, where they might become damaged and they are sent to the conservation lab to have this active process of conservation carried out. So this might be similar to item level description. And then you have restoration, which is also item-based, but this is where records have been damaged, and a lot of time and effort is put into restoring the record to its former condition. So this is sort of the creme de la creme of preservation acts, represented by Giannis here. So sort of the pinnacle of preservation activities that archives can engage in. And so I also want to differentiate under this umbrella of preservation, as the Phillips article mentions. There are also preventative acts of preservation and what Phillips describes as holding maintenance. So this is just things like making sure that that stacks are swept, that they're pest-free, some of the other issues that we'll talk about. And then preventative preservation is, going through and making sure all the staples are removed, all the paper clips are removed, things that are going to help the records, at least theoretically, survive for a longer amount of time. So the idea here is, again, that as we move further up to this pyramid, the fewer records are going to receive this level of care and attention. So most archives can't have all of their records in a climate controlled environment because climate control is expensive. So it may be that most records are outside of climate control, There are some that are in climate control, records that are chosen for whatever reason due to their importance or any other factors. And there's a subset of records that receive this preventative care where, the time and energy is put into removing staples and paper clips and things like that, which may undermine the record's long-term health. And according to MPLP, which the Phillips article really takes offense to, you know, instances of this kind of preventive preservation are going to be few and far between, right? Because MPLPs focus on sort of the umbrella efforts, minimal description, minimal preservation, don't worry about the paper clips and so on. So from the MPLP perspective, this little section might be even smaller. But anyway, for a vast amount of records, this sort of basic level of preservation care is all that they're going to receive. And for a small amount of records that are determined to be particularly important for whatever reason, they might be sent to the conservation lab, which is, cost time and money and skill. And then if records are truly, truly important, then they might be sent in for restoration. But again, as the Miller chapter notes, this is pretty uncommon for archives. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that, these are value judgments that archives make. There are value judgments that they make when they're saying, we're going to afford these records a very basic level of preservation. We're not going to worry about putting them in climate control. We're not going to worry about removing the staples and the paper clips because we just don't think they're important for whatever reason. But there are records that we feel like are truly important, or at least more important, so we're going to make sure that they are in climate control, that they do have the staples removed, and if they ever need conservation work or restoration work, we'll spend the money to have that taken care of. And so again, as with things like online access and appraisal and arrangement description and some of the other topics that we talked about, it's archivists making those determinations to a great extent and deciding which records are going to be preserved better, which records are going to survive longer in the future and serve as a basis for researchers to use and as a basis for shaping social memory. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the basic ways that archives can take care of records. So this is going to fall into more of the basic level of preservation. A lot of this is going to rely on climate control in order to be achieved, unless you just sort of naturally have stacks in your archives that meet all these different criteria, which is pretty unlikely. But this is sort of like the basics of the best environment that archival records can be maintained in order to reduce the damage that they experience and the potential challenges to their authenticity. So the first one we have here is to keep it cool. So you want to keep your stacks in an environment that is nice and cool. I think the Miller chapter describes between 68 and 74 degrees Fahrenheit. So, when records experience heat, it speeds up chemical reactions, which can cause the records to decay quickly. So you want to keep them nice and cool, like the fawns. You also want to keep your records nice and dry, so you want to have a lower level of relative humidity. This can prevent the records from swelling due to moisture and then drying out and then swelling and drying out, which can cause a lot of damage for the records. So obviously that's something that you want to avoid. Most moist environments can also increase levels of things like mold and other nasty, organisms that you don't want living on your records and eating your records. So you want to keep it nice and dry. You want to keep your materials in the dark. things like heat or like light can create heat, which can again speed up these chemical reactions, and light can impact records by causing fading, especially sort of stronger fluorescent light. So the more you can uh, keep your records from being exposed to light, the better off they will be. Okay, obviously you want to keep your records secure, especially when they're being used by researchers. Uh, there was a huge craze, uh, decades and decades ago where people were collecting autographs by cutting them out of books and out of archival documents. Obviously, this is a big no-no, a big source of damage for archival records, and obviously a challenge to their authenticity. So, you want to have a nice and secure reading room. You want to have a nice, secure stack so that people can't kind of wander in and out and take things off the shelves without authorization. So just the physical security of records is an important consideration when it comes to preservation. You want to keep your records clean, so filtering out dirty air and pollution, which can be abrasive and can cause damage to your records. So, typically this is going to involve some kind of HVAC system, air purification system. And again, archives aren't going to be able to provide that necessarily to every part of their building. So it may be just a subset of records which are in areas that have air purifiers and other measures taken to prevent this kind of pollution from impacting them. You definitely want to keep your records in an area that's pest-free. So, obviously you don't want rats or rodents of unusual size living in your stacks and, making nests out of valuable records and important research material. It could be things like silverfish or innumerable pests that want to get in and eat paper and eat book bindings and otherwise damage your record. So that's something that you need to be aware of and prevent as much as possible. Okay, you definitely want to keep your records safe from fire. Um, fires can be very destructive for archival records. Uh, Even if you have a sprinkler system and stacks, that's going to spray water down onto your records. So that's obviously not ideal. It's better than the burning, but it's going to create another set of problems. So, obviously you want to prevent fires as much as possible. Kind of as an interesting aside, one time I was touring the archives for the city of Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and the archivist who is giving us the tour said that at one point they had installed a fire suppression system that basically sucked all the oxygen out of the room when it detected fire, but they ended up having to not use it because they determined that if there was someone in the room by the time they were able to get out, it would have sucked all the oxygen out of the room and that person, would have passed out. So obviously, uh, not the best solution for fire safety, right? You want to keep your records basic. You want to prevent your records from being too acidic, which can break down records. A lot of paper that archival records uh, has been printed on over time can be acidic, and there are steps that archives can take to reduce the acidity of records. You can add sort of buffers between papers. You can actually have the acid removed from them, but I'm sure that would be very expensive and labor intensive. But as much as possible, you want to prevent your records from being uh, exposed to exposed to acid. It could be something like refoldering to look at more preventative preservation steps and things like that. And then finally, you want to keep your records stable. So you want to keep the conditions that your records are in from uh, being in conditions that are changing all the time. So I talked about if records are in an area that is humid and then dry, then humid and then dry, that can cause the records to swell and then retract and then swell and retract, which can cause a lot of damage. Um, if you have stacks that are in an area where light is constantly um, coming on and going off and coming on and going off, that can be problematic. Fluctuations in temperature can be problematic. So uh, honestly, you're better off if you have your records in conditions that aren't terribly ideal as long as they're stable than if you have records in conditions that are stable some of the time and then not stable and then stable some of the time and then not stable because that can cause a lot of damage. Okay, so those are just some of the overviews of sort of basic preservation, basic holdings maintenance. And again, archives aren't able to, unless they're very well resourced, to place all of their records in areas that are in perfect climate control. And they have to make choices about which records are going to be prioritized and put in climate control and which records aren't. And that is an example of creation by archivists because it's archivists making a choice about which information is going to survive for some records versus which information is going to survive for other records and which information is going to be available for researchers from certain records in the future. So going back to this idea of different types of curatorship uh, that influence the nature of records and the information that survives for researchers to look at, the choices that archives make about which records to prioritize and make sure that they receive adequate or even sort of above and beyond levels of preservation. That's a good example of some of the curatorship that we have talked about so far in this course. And we'll look at some other examples of curatorship as well. Another factor that archives should consider when making preservation choices is making sure that they are engaging in preservation that is sensitive to the different cultures and beliefs of different communities that might be represented in archives. So, for instance, in some communities or some religions or some community groups may have different ideas related to preservation than the archive might have. So, one example that I can think of that I wrote about it is uh, some manuscripts were found buried in Egypt, and it turned out that these manuscripts were uh, attempts to write the Torah, so sort of the Holy Scripture that the Jewish community uses, and because mistakes had been made, these records were buried. They weren't allowed to be burned, but they were not perfect, so they were buried. And they were just sort of meant to be kept there until they kind of naturally decayed. But people found them from the University of Cambridge, and now there's this effort to preserve them and make them accessible, despite the fact that they were meant to be sort of buried and forgotten and not seen again. So this is an example of preservation that goes against the wishes and cultural norms of a community. Um, and obviously, that's not something that I feel archives should necessarily engage in, and that it should be up to the communities to which records creators belong to have some, if not total, say in how records related to that community are maintained over time. It's just sort of insensitive for archivists to say, well, we have our professional beliefs, we have our professional attitudes, and we feel like those are more important than your cultural concerns or your cultural norms. So, we're going to do it our way. But in those particular situations, I do feel like the community that the records come from should have more of a creative role in saying how records are preserved over time, because I don't know, that just seems like the sort of enlightened and right thing to do. Okay, so it's important when you think about preservation to consider all the administrative background or structure that preservation requires. And that's something that the Miller chapter for this week discusses. So the author mentions things like conducting a preservation survey, so going through your records to see what kind of preservation concerns exist so that you are able to address them. Using your survey information to identify preservation priorities, which I just touched on. Establishing guidelines for the storage and handling of materials. So saying we want to make sure that these materials are kept in this environment as much as possible. Maybe saying we don't care about these as much, so we're going to put these in this sort of less than ideal environment. This is where some of the value judgments that I talk about might be codified, where the archive sort of sets its preservation priorities. Uh, and also this idea of placing your preservation plan in the larger context of how your archive operates. So encouraging, as the Hegbarth Dean article mentions, encouraging people who are appraising records to think about preservation problems or issues that might be associated with records before they even come into the archive. Encouraging your processing archivists to be on the lookout for any potential preservation issues that might be going on. Encouraging your reference staff to keep an eye out for any preservation issues that they see. So tying preservation into all the different activities that an archive might engage in. So the Miller chapter, there's some priorities for preservation planning. So establishing a regular environmental monitoring program. You're not going to know the relative humidity and temperature of your records unless you have some way to monitor it, right? So when I worked at the American Heritage Center, there were these measurement tools, and some of the student workers would come through and check them every day to make sure that the temperature and humidity and other environmental conditions were at an acceptable level. And that way, okay, everything is working fine, or, it looks like the humidity is too high in here. What's going on? Can we do something like that? It just gives you knowledge to be able to respond if you need to. Implementing and maintaining an emergency response plan, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Storing materials appropriately. And that could be as simple as making sure that records are in folders that are in boxes that aren't too tight and are going to kind of like squeeze them and cause friction every time the record is taken out. Making sure that records that might be more delicate, like glass plate negatives, are placed in boxes that have some kind of padding or some kind of protection so that the negatives don't shatter. Maintaining regular housekeeping to get rid of some of those pests or prevent some of those pests that we talked about, and identifying and treating high-risk materials. So if you see something that is an issue when you do your preservation survey, just saying, okay, we see that this is a problem, and let's think of ways that we can reduce the potential damage to these records in the future. So again, it's important to note that when you conduct a preservation survey, you're not necessarily going to have the time to conduct one for every collection in your stacks, right? That could be, tens of thousands of records. So you're going to have to prioritize certain collections and certain records. And so that's a value judgment, right? We don't really care about finding preservation risks and these collections, but we are more concerned about any that are in these collections. Another thing that I want to mention about preservation surveys is that if a collection has been processed thoroughly, then these types of surveys may be less necessary or be less labor intensive, because if you preserve records to a deeper level, then ideally you have more of an understanding of the preservation risks that are present in a collection because you spent more time sort of going through the collection and looking at the collection, and that can make the need for these preservation surveys to be less of an issue. So it goes back to this whole MPLP versus preservation discussion, which I'll touch on a little bit in just a few slides. Okay, and so of course all these things have to be done within the context of an archive's resources. If you are an individual that is the only person working at your archive, so the lone arranger type of archive, then you can't spend all of your time doing preservation surveys, right? You can't spend all of your time establishing guidelines. You may be able to adapt some from other institutions, but you can't focus all of your time and energy on preservation when you have to do arrangement description and reference and all the other things that we've talked about and will talk about. So again, you have to kind of place preservation within the larger context of everything else that your archive has to accomplish, and making sure that you're not devoting too many resources to one aspect of archiving, as important and well known as it might be. Okay, so to talk about emergency planning a little bit, kind of thinking of another administrative aspect of preservation, so Miller argues that it is vital to preservation, so it's something that you can't kind of ignore or not address. I should cover all foreseeable hazards. So if you live in California, you probably want to have some kind of a response to an earthquake or a wildfire in place, right? If you live in Oklahoma, you better have a plan for tornadoes. If you live in an area that's prone for flooding, that's probably something that you should plan on addressing at some point as well. So just kind of knowing what is most likely to occur in your location, in your building. If you know that your building has old pipes that may burst, then you should be aware of that and have some kind of plan for it. So forewarned is forearmed, as they say. Okay, and so what an emergency plan can do is that it can reduce the amount of time that it takes your archive to respond to any kind of situations that occur. So instead of sort of running around with no idea what to do, you have the emergency plan in place, and you can just respond, and that will probably result in fewer records being lost and fewer amounts of damage, less damage to your archives records. And that's sort of less issues that you have to worry down the road, less, money that you have to spend on conservation if you choose to go that route. So it just decreases the response time, which can be very beneficial. Okay, so it involves training, letting your staff learn how to respond to situations by knowing where supplies are and how to use them. Any outside vendors to contact, so maybe people that specialize in drying out records, or repairing and responding to smoke damage. And again, just having responses to a variety of emergencies planned for. And so this is from the Miller chapter for this week. So again, preservation is more than just keeping things in a nice location and hoping everything goes for the best. There is a part of it that is a little bit more active, related to some of the holdings, maintenance, and preservation administrative activities that are as much of a part of preservation as keeping things dark and keeping them cool. So it's just important to see both sides of that and to understand that preservation extends beyond sort of the typical understanding of what preservation looks like. Okay, so next we'll talk about this conflict between MPLP and preservation, which the Phillips article addresses quite a bit. Um, so as I touched on, there can be, and as Phillips touches on, there can be a lot of conflicts between the idea of MPLP and preservation. So with MPLP, you're just trying to get through arrangement description as quickly as possible, and that may result in archives not being cognizant of different preservation risks and issues that are present in archival collections. And Phillips argues that this is a pretty short-sighted response to backlogs or other issues that may prevent records from being available to the public. So on page 473, the author talks about how collections must be accessible, but they also must be sustainable. If you have a collection that is available for researchers right away, but it has, preservation issues that are going to result in the records, degrading quickly and, potentially beyond repair, then, those records aren't going to be accessible for as long as they would be if archives had taken more time to become more aware of preservation risks present in the collections to begin with. Phillips also talks about the reductivist view of preservation that MPLP espouses or suggests. With MPLP, it just says keep things in climate control, and in very rare circumstances, do things like remove paper clips and staples. But Phillips notes that a lot of archives can't afford climate control or don't have access to climate control. So it's sort of a false sense of security to say, oh, let climate control handle it, because not every archive can certainly do that. So overall, Phillips is arguing that, preservation is accessibility, and there has to be more of a balance between preservation and accessibility than Green and Meissner's MPLP article would suggest. So maybe kind of finding more of a middle ground between saying, just ignore preservation and get things out there, and uh, this idea of taking the time and preserving every single record within a collection as much as possible. There's definitely room for a lot of middle ground there, and it's something that I tried to keep in mind when I was processing records. There could be a lot of staples in archival collections, and spend the time to take them all out would really lengthen the process. But at the same time, you have to be aware of what's going on and take the time to kind of familiarize yourself with any issues that you can see. So, as with most things, the moderate approach is usually the best. Okay, so now I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about this idea of permanence that the O'Toole article is focused on. So O'Toole talks about when archives bring records into archival institutions, they are making a commitment to preserve these records into the indefinite future. And so when we discuss appraisal, we talked about how this is a value judgment, right? This is saying that some records are more important than others and more worthy of preservation into the future. So again, this implies that archives are going to preserve the permanence of these records and make them available for uh, as long as possible, essentially. And this open-ended relationship involves a substantial amount of resources. resources to, again, arrange and describe, to make records accessible, and to preserve records into the indefinite future as well. But the O'Toole article notes that this idea of permanence hasn't really been interrogated in the archival community and within archival academic literature uh, too thoroughly. So you can think of all the different preservation actions that I just talked about as attempts to maintain the permanence of records, right? To preserve their permanence so that the records are available into the future for as long as possible. But it's important to note, as the O'Toole article discusses, that there is a difference between the permanence of records in their original format and where the information contained in the records survives. So I talked about authenticity. Records that are preserved in their original format is an example of a higher level of authenticity. So not only is the writing on the record preserved over time, but the original paper that the letter was written in. So not only do you have the information, but you can sort of feel the paper, and that can tell you, something about the conditions under which it was written. Just by the type of paper, maybe it has stains or other things that you can use to glean more information from them, more contextual information. Whereas if you just have the words that were written, then you lose sort of the touch and feel and some of the contextual clues about the record that might otherwise be preserved. And again, whether to preserve records in the original format or just preserve the information is a choice that archives make. So if archivists are interested in preserving the original format, then they're going to engage in a higher degree of preservation activities, and even up to including conservation and restoration. So they're going to go further up that pyramid that we looked at earlier in order to make sure that not only is the information contained, but the original carrier or the original format of the information is contained as well. If they're just interested in having the information retained, but they don't really care if the paper that it's on, starts to fade or crumble a little bit, then the records are going to receive a more basic level of preservation care. And again, this can have some impacts on the authenticity of the record and how valuable the record is for a researcher, which as I just touched on. But it's interesting to note how this discussion over permanence of records in their original format versus just preserving the information has changed over time. And this is something that the O'Toole article describes briefly. So earlier on, especially O'Toole talks about, time around the time of the beginning of the American Revolution, there was a lot of emphasis on making copies so that the information was preserved. And that was because there were a lot of fires and other disasters that tended to result in a loss of records and a loss of information. So the idea was, we'll just create a lot of records of the information, so that way if something happens, the original record may be lost, but at least we have the information, scattered in archives or in libraries, maybe throughout the city or throughout the state, so that the information survives. So definitely a focus on preserving the information in records and not necessarily the original format. Again, just as kind of like a pragmatic response to what was going on at the time. We'll talk about digital preservation next week, but this is actually an idea that digital preservation is embraced. So this idea of making lots of copies of preserved records and scattering them around so that if, say, something happens and a server is deleted, the records may exist on another server or even many servers so that the records can be just pulled off of those and preserved in that way. Okay, but as technology progressed, it became more possible for archives to maintain not just the information, but also the look and feel, the actual image of the record. So a tool talks about the development of microfilm. If any of you have used microfilm, you probably know that it's not the most enjoyable experience. Anytime I had to use it when I was working at the AHC, inevitably I was thinking this, my eyes hurt. But it was one example to attempt to retain both the original look and feel and the information contained in the records. But technology and technological advances allowed archivists to stop, slow, or even reverse deterioration, and as the O'Toole article describes, control the ravages of time. And so there was more of a focus on preserving records in their original form, and more of a dissatisfaction with just making copies of records and using that as a preservation strategy. And there was also an emphasis on some of the unique characteristics that records had that needed to be preserved, things like intrinsic value, which we'll touch on in just a little bit. And so here we see a shift away from just preserving the information and more towards saving records in their original format. Again, advances in science, advances in technology made this this shift more possible. All right, but eventually archivists decided and realized that because collections were getting so large, there just weren't enough resources available for archivists to maintain every single record in its original format, and that some records just needed to be left to rot. So this is Maynard Richford, who wrote a preservation manual that was pretty influential in archives around this time. And he described this idea as being sinful, but again, a pragmatic approach to realizing that a lot of records didn't necessarily need to be preserved in their original format, and in a lot of instances, just preserving the information was enough, and that we didn't as archivists need to be spending a lot of resources on preserving everything as well as we could when we're just preserving a lot of information that necessarily wasn't important and wasn't needed to use the records. So we see more of a shift back towards a focus on preserving information and not preserving everything in its original format, even if archives had the technical ability to do so. They may have had the technical ability, but they didn't have the financial ability to keep everything in perfectly climate controlled areas and have everything conserved and restored when it was necessary and appropriate. So again, archivists had to kind of make a choice and say, well, we're going to try and preserve some things in their original format, but for most of it, we can just kind of let it rot. And by the time it's deteriorated or too fragile to use, it's probably not going to be too valuable or interesting anyway. So again, a very pragmatic choice that archivists had to make. But there was this idea of intrinsic value, or ways that archives can separate some records as being more valuable than others. So things like aesthetic value, exhibit value, instances in which the physical form might be an object of study. So I'm thinking of like wax cylinders. The information on a wax cylinder might not be terribly important, but just because there are so few of them left, that might lead archivists to try and preserve them as carefully as possible. And things just have general or public interest because of direct association with famous or historically significant persons or events. So a lot of this is pretty subjective, right? Everyone has different ideas of aesthetic value or exhibit value, um, general or public interest. That's a pretty vague term. So this idea of intrinsic value is being a solid rationale for deciding whether or not to keep records in their original format as much as possible, or again, just kind of let them rot. It's not really enough of a solid determinant for me. There have to be other things like use and maybe connection to an archive's mission that have to be considered as well. The O'Toole article discusses how only 0.5% of all records should receive conservation treatment. So a very small percentage. And then, how do archives decide what that 0.5 is? Do they use intrinsic value? Are there other things that help them make that valuation and that determination? Who knows, right? So again, that goes back to this idea of creation by archivists. Are we as archivists choosing to preserve records in their original format, or are we just kind of letting them rot? And what goes into the decision making surrounding that choice? Okay, so we'll talk briefly about archives within the continuum and how preservation is an activity that takes place pretty much constantly from the moment that a record is created until the moment it is destroyed. And that's something that the Hackbart Dean article really touches on about how choices made by records creators and custodians prior to archival custody can impact the condition of records, and that archives need to consider the results of these choices when appraising these records. So if records have been preserved very poorly, then an archivist might say, well, we're not going to even touch these because they've been in a basement and they're all moldy, or we just don't have the resources to take care of these records as well as we would like to, or as well as we need to. And also tying preservation into arrangement and description, which I touched on. So as you are arranging and describing records, identifying any potential preservation issues, maybe addressing them yourself, through the dreaded staple and paperclip removal. That's another example of preservation in the continuum. I talked about preservation when reference work is being carried out. So again, it's not just something that exists once at a certain point of time, but exists throughout the life of a record. We talked about preservation surveys. So that's another example of preservation continuing over time, sort of between when records are arranged and described and when they're accessed for reference. There's also a lot to be said for reappraising records over time to make sure that the level of care they're receiving meets their level of importance. So, thinking, do we really need to preserve these records as well as we have been, considering what we know now about the content or the context of these records? And there's also a lot to be said about working with records creators before records come into archives to make sure that they're taking care of their records. To, maybe have workshops or meeting with donors or potential donors where archivists say, hey, ideally, if you want these records to survive, or if you're planning on donating these someday, then here are some of the conditions that you might try and keep these records in until we're able to take them off your hands. And that will reduce a lot of the preservation work that archives have to engage in further down the road. So we can connect this idea of continuum preservation work with creation by the individual traditionally named as the creator, because the preservation choices that they make influence what archives have to deal with and what researchers have to deal with down the road. And again, and also creation by custodians. So and maybe your family that's taking care of your records, and their choices when it comes to that are going to influence what records look like in the future as well. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. People might have a pretty simplistic view of preservation and what it is, but hopefully you realize that it's so much more, that it is a continuation of the value judgments that archives make that we have talked about. Hopefully you have more of an understanding of the different records creators that we've talked about and how they influence preservation. And hopefully you understand that, again, a lot of the time, you just have to let things rot and you have to really make a conscious choice of whether or not how you're trying to preserve records meets the level of importance and the level of value that records actually have. And by having that conversation, as the O'Toole article notes, you can allow your archives to spend resources that it was spending unnecessarily on preserving every single record as much as possible, and using those resources to maybe improve appraisal or arrangement description or other things that can help your archives operate better in the future. So a lot of different interesting twists and ramifications related to preservation work, and I hope you found them interesting. So thank you for listening and have a great week.